Joining me now is the Senator Gary Peters, the chairman of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, which issued the report. This week, for the second time in a row, he topped the list as the most effective U.S. senator by the Nonpartisan Center for Effective Lawmaking. Congratulations on that, Senator. It might be because you're talking about drugs. People really, this doesn't feel political, or at least it shouldn't be political, although in fairness, when you tried to limit the amount people pay for their insulin, it did get political. So that's strange. But let's talk about this issue right now. How serious is it?
Well, it is serious, and I'm glad you're talking about it here on your program here today. As we were looking into this issue and talking to hospitals, we focused primarily on hospital drugs. We found that hospitals all across the country on a regular basis, sometimes weekly, have to review which drugs are in short supply or not available that week. But they still need to provide medication to their patients. It's a patient care situation, and they have to look at other opportunities. And what they find to replace a drug is oftentimes less effective and also more expensive, which doesn't make sense. And in some cases, as you mentioned in the opening, particular with cancer drugs, there isn't an alternative, and they need to ration medication. And that's happening here in the United States on a regular basis. Consumers are seeing it on store shelves at their local pharmacy, but hospitals oftentimes are even in a more critical situation, particularly with the injectable types of medication.
Let's talk about, I mean, when in the COVID crisis, we learned that we don't make masks, right? Because masks are cheap things. We send them to lower labor countries to make, and that becomes a problem. And there's some argument that we should be able to make essential things here in the United States. Is that what this is, or is there something more complicated than the idea that people just make these in other countries and they're cheaper?
Well, that's a big part of it. In fact, the initial report that we put out on drug shortages was in 2019. And the conclusion in that report, we said that when there is a pandemic in this country, we're going to find ourselves in a precarious situation. And to your point, that's exactly what happened on things like masks and even swabs, some just basic kinds of medical supplies. Because it's offshore, because it's cheap, it's a race to the bottom in that regard. So you have, as you mentioned, when it comes to injectable medications, almost 90+% of the precursors that go into those medications are made primarily in China, but also in India, which makes us beholden. If there's any kind of conflict between the countries, that could come to an end, which would put us in a precarious situation, clearly a national security issue or homeland security issue. But we also find there's, in addition to that, highly concentrated manufacturing, especially in these generics. You may have only one facility that actually makes that particular drug, and if anything happens to that facility, there's a major supply disruption. And that's what we found in this report is there's not real great transparency as to where these drugs are coming from and where gaps may exist. What we know is even if they may be cheap, but this supply system is not resilient. And any kind of hiccup in the supply chain can cause major ramifications for both patient health and Homeland Security.
Your colleague, Senator Rand Paul, has blamed FDA regulations for the shortage, and he points to payer price controls. Can you explain what this is and whether you agree?
Yeah, well, it's, we've asked our other experts. That's not the issue. And actually, it's the fact that we've got lower and lower priced drugs, which the generics, which tends to take competition out of the marketplace, where you only have one or two manufacturers that make these drugs. Part of the reason the prices are low is because they're long-term contracts. Medicare will enter into a long-term contract to try to bring down the cost of drugs. So it's not a regulatory factor. It's the fact that these are highly concentrated production in either geographically or just by the number of actual suppliers that are out there, which is causing the problem, which is why we need to have more transparency. We do need to onshore. We have to be bringing this production back, similar to what we did with semiconductors. We saw the fact that we were resilient for semiconductors, and being the senator from Michigan, the impact on the auto industry was significant. But this is life-saving. When you're talking about drugs, this is about life and death and the health of the American people. We have to make this stuff in the United States of America, and that's a big part of what we're going to be focused on is how do we bring this production back home.
Senator, right now tensions are rising between the United States and China. Does that have any impact on this discussion?
Well, it could. And when you think about those tensions and when we are basically beholden to the Chinese for a high percentage of all of the critical ingredients that go into basically every drug that we use here in this country, that puts us in a precarious situation, and certainly gives the Chinese a great deal of leverage if they're controlling the supply of those precursors that go into so many medications that patients here in the United States rely on each and every day.